Let's get going. Good. Welcome, everybody. This is part 3 of this year's BGA FRTOL course. This evening, Andrew will be doing the presentation and Chula will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, please send them to Chula. Coaches, as normal, please make sure you have a star in front of your name, otherwise we won't get you in a group. Couple of admin things, or one admin thing. The link, which some people struggled with a bit, because when you signed up for parts 2 to 6, well, sorry, when you registered for parts 2 to 6, you would have been sent the link. I don't know where that email comes from me, it might do, but it will come via Zoom. So it's the same link as you used last week, and you'll use it next week and the week after. So please see if you can find that and put it somewhere safe so you can find it again. That would be really helpful, and then I won't have to send lots of people emergency links. And I think it'll probably keep our records better as well. So thank you for that. This evening then, Andrew, Chula, anything else we need to say before we kick off?
It just occurred to me why it's useful that people do maintain the discipline of sending it to the nominated person, i.e. me tonight. And that's if you and I need to chat to each other, then if we look at the chat, we know it's about the management of the evening. So Please send them to the nominated person. Thanks.
Yeah. So any questions, send those to Chula. They're more likely to get read out if that happens. Okay, fantastic. Then let's kick off. Andrew, you're on.
Okay, let's see if I can work the magic here.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to mute everybody, and everybody, Andrew, you'll have to unmute. Off you go.
And in fact, it didn't mute me. Obviously, co-hosts have some privileges. Right, let's see if we can make this magic work. Here we go. So can you see, just give me a wave if you can see BGA FRTOL course part 3. Thanks very much, Jared. Okay, so here's the agenda for this evening. As every week, we're going to start with a recap of the topics you should already have studied in the recorded lectures, the canned lectures. So we'll rattle through this week's topics very quickly, probably as much as anything just to crystallize any questions you may have. If you have questions, as Paul has said, please text them in the chat session to Chula. So after we've been through this evening's topics, it's the question session, and then we'll go into breakouts, which should be the greater part of the evening, hopefully about an hour, and we're going to do 2 breakouts this evening. I'll briefly explain each of them first, and then you'll do them back to back in the sessions with your coaches. So there's no need to come back into the main session between doing the two breakouts this evening, which are Bryce and Lakenheath. Okay, so quickly rattling through the topics you should already have studied in the online lecture. Transponders. If you fly a Wood or a GRP glider, and that's almost all of us in the UK, you will give a very weak radar return. The signal just gets absorbed by the wood or fiberglass rather than bouncing back. It's also the case that even if you give a strong radar return in an aluminium glider, ground radar cannot directly detect your altitude. So almost all powered aircraft and 1 or 2 gliders carry a gadget called a transponder. And this receives each radar pulse as it's bouncing off the aircraft and transmits a strong secondary signal at the same time as the primary is being returned by the glider. And that strong secondary signal in old transponders encodes 2 pieces of information. One is a so-called squawk code, and the other is your altitude, or more properly actually your flight level, because it's relative to 1013. If you have a more modern transponder, as many people do, a Mode S transponder, it sends all sorts of other information as well. But for the purposes of this evening, it's squawk code and altitude. Now, you should only ever, you set the squawk code on the control panel in the cockpit, and the bottom right of the slide here is a picture of a front panel of a transponder. You only ever change that squawk code to anything other than 7,000 or 2,000 if told to by a controller. The only exception to that is if you're flying in a TRAG, a temporary reserved area for gliders, above flight level 195. I understand you're supposed to squawk 7006. So you are squawking either 7,000 or 2,000 until you talk to a controller. There are a couple of other buttons on the front of the transponder, in particular the ident button, which, again, if asked by a controller, you may press, and that will make your return on his or her radar screen light up more strongly. So when you have a transponder, your squawk code and your altitude show up on the radar screen of a suitably equipped controller. This screenshot, which you should also have seen in the online lectures, I think is actually taken from, it looks like it was an airprox or maybe an infringement report. The infringing aircraft is circled there. But you can see all the other aircraft have a 4-digit code against them, which is their squawk code, and a 2-digit code, which is, I believe, their flight level. And this obviously helps the controller to work out who's who. Now, there's a whole stack of secondary surveillance radar, that's to say transponder phraseology, which you should know. I've summarized some of it on this slide. I'm not going to go through it in any great depth. That's for offline study. But the one thing I would point out, if you don't have a transponder, as for instance I don't, your response when asked to squawk or indeed to do anything relating to a transponder is the words negative transponder, meaning I do not have a transponder. So let's talk about services, and particular basic service. What is a basic service? According to the Manual of Air Traffic Services, it allows the Air Traffic Service Unit, the controller, to give pilots information that is useful for the safe and efficient conduct of flights. Now, that may include things like unsolicited information about nearby traffic that the controller knows about, but really don't bet on it. That's not, in general, part of the contract of a basic service. From our point of view, as glider pilots, particularly if we're not transponding, more importantly, a basic service gives us a framework to tell the controller where we are. If they have no radar, they can't see us at all. If they have radar, but we have no transponder, at best, we're going to be a weak and intermittent primary return with no altitude information. So if you call up a nearby airfield as you're flying by, a busy airfield as you're flying by, and ask for a basic service, in my opinion, the biggest reason for doing this is it lets you tell the controller, first of all, that you're there at all, and secondly, information about your altitude, which, remember, even if they have radar, they don't know if you don't have a transponder, and where you are. Basic service can be provided to both VFR and IFR flights in uncontrolled airspace, that is Class G airspace. It can also be given to VFR flights, but not IFR flights in Class E controlled airspace. And a basic service can be provided by only two kinds of controller, an air traffic control officer, an ATCO, or a FISO. And a FISO, as you know, provides an information service. An air-to-ground operator cannot give you a basic service. So Enstone Radio, for instance, cannot give you a basic service. If you get a basic service, you have a few obligations. The first and most important thing to say is that you are free to maneuver exactly as you wish, unless you have specifically agreed a limitation with the controller for coordination with other aircraft. So if in your opening, your preamble talking to the controller, you've agreed, not below 2,500 feet, then you should keep to that. And if you need to break that limitation for any reason, you should tell the controller as soon as possible. But leaving aside special cases like that, you're free to maneuver as you wish. You should respond to requests to report position. And all the way through my slides, if you see text in block caps in blue, these are the words you would use, or rather, in this case, the words the controller would use. They would ask you to report position. Your reply should be your call sign, your position, perhaps relative to some obvious 500,000 chart feature, the time, your level, and properly speaking, you should also tell them your next waypoint and your ETA. Now, obviously, in a glider, your ETA is in the lap of the gods, and you might perhaps be forgiven for leaving off an ETA. As for a next waypoint, I think it would be acceptable to say the general direction in which you're flying, tracking west, tracking north, or whatever. If you're thermaling, this would be a great opportunity to use the the term thermaling, which is now in CAP 413. If you're busy, if you are indeed scratching a weak thermal, trying to gain heights, if you've got your hands full, then by all means tell the controller to stand by. But of course, you should come back to them as soon as possible with your position report. Now, if you're asked to report position, a trick that I use, I actually carry a separate handheld GPS in the cockpit. Before I call up and ask for the basic service, I set up that GPS to give me distance and direction to the airfield I'm getting the basic service from, so that if they ask for a position report, I can just glance down at the screen and say 3.4 nautical miles, QDM 240 degrees, or whatever. QDM is the bearing from me to the airfield. It would probably be more convenient for the controller if I gave them the bearing, my bearing from them, but hopefully they can do the maths. And I know that at several controllers sitting in front of consoles that'll do the maths for them and tell them, and if I tell them 240, then they can subtract 180 and work out that 060 degrees. Most importantly, before you leave the channel, if you're getting a basic service, before you leave the channel, you must tell them that you're leaving. We had a very embarrassing incident at Cambridge a few years back where we tasked a competition past the northern edge of the Cambridge ATZ, and all the contestants called, which was great. We ran them out of slips in the tower that day, but then embarrassingly for the rest of the afternoon, every half hour, the controller was broadcasting a laundry list of gliders, Delta Mike, are you still on frequency? People who had called up for service but then changed channel without telling the controller. You must tell them you're leaving the frequency. Under CAP 413, the terminology for that would be changing to station and channel. So changing to Cotswold approach on whatever the channel would be. If you're not going to change to another station, if, for instance, you're just going to turn the radio off because you want to save the battery for later, there is no CAP 413 terminology for this. So we've agreed with the CAA that the correct terminology will be leaving the frequency. In past years on this course and elsewhere, I've seen people use the term changing en route. It turns out that senior FRTOL examiners really don't like that phrase. So please, if you are going to do the FRTOL exam, don't use it. Use the term leaving the frequency. Above all, as I put in red at the bottom of the slide, if you're in receipt of a basic service, avoiding all other traffic absolutely remains your responsibility. Now, there is one other organisation that you can get a basic service from, and we haven't mentioned this in previous years on the course, but there is in the south, in England, there is a service called London Information, and north of the border, Scottish Information. And hopefully you can read on the map on the right-hand side of that slide the channel numbers to use in different parts of the country to get in touch with London or Scottish Information. Now, they can give you a basic service. They can't do a whole lot else for you. They don't have radar. It's typically one controller working possibly dozens or maybe even 100 aircraft. They don't have a lot of time to devote to you. They could give you very basic information on things like QNH, maybe weather forecast. I'll be honest with you, in 20 years of flying with a FRTOL, I've never used London Information, and I really don't know a glider pilot who has. But again, although we try to avoid saying this, this is one occasion where it would be appropriate to perhaps do something different in the exam to what you'll do in real life. The examiners that we worked with last year really wanted candidates to switch to London or Scottish Information as appropriate in between working different regional airfields. And I can think of one occasion with hindsight when I perhaps should have used London Information. A couple of years ago, I was doing an out and return to Malvern. I got close to Malvern. I looked down at my flight computer. There was a NOTAM I hadn't noticed for apparently a parachute jumping exercise. And I certainly didn't want to be getting in the way of parachutists, so I skirted round that NOTAMed area, which of course happened to be right over the turning point. Had to go into the sector on the backside. Now, with 2020 hindsight, what I could have done is called up London Information, asked for clarification on that NOTAM. And I'd have discovered, of course, it wasn't parachute jumping at all. It was paragliding, and they were all safely below me, skirting the hill, and it would have been no problem to fly through that NOTAMed area. So London Information exists. There are, I think, rare occasions where it might be useful to you in real life, and you should definitely consider using it in the exam if you're doing the exam. And they will give you a basic service. Now, when you call up for a basic service, it's possible you will be asked to report reaching a known point at some point in the future. You actually saw this not in a basic service, but you saw this last week when the imaginary controller asked you to report south abeam at Enstone or report north abeam at Oxford. Abeam, incidentally, is a term that means at right angles to your track. So if you report north abeam Oxford, it means, and you're going from the east to the west, it means you're looking down the left wing at Oxford. You are north of Oxford. So this is, I'm putting procedural in inverted commas because that isn't the CAP 413 term, but we'll call it that for the moment. So when you call up for the service, you're asked to report at a future moment when you are, for instance, north abeam Oxford. Respond to the request with Wilco. Don't read back the request for a position report. It is not a read back item. But when you reach the reporting point, then you will give your call sign, your position, the time, your level, and again, your next waypoint and perhaps your ETA as best you can. So for instance, if I was turning Bury St Edmunds and I'd been asked to report Bury St Edmunds, I might reply when I got there, glider Charlie Delta, Bury St Edmunds, 47, altitude 4,000 feet, tracking to Ely. And the 47 is the time, it was 47 minutes past the hour. Now, this happens to me occasionally. In talking to others, it doesn't seem to happen to pilots who have transponders, but those of us who aren't transponding, particularly at places like Lakenheath, sometimes get denied a service. You call up, you ask for service, they can't identify you because you have no transponder, and they deny you a service. If it happens, the first thing to say is it's rare, and the second thing to say is don't fret. It's their loss if it happens. We suggest, if it happens, that you acknowledge with something like Roger, leaving the frequency. And I do monthly briefings over at Lakenheath, glider safety briefings. If you are denied a basic service, specifically at Lakenheath, and you let me know, I will flag it as part of the routine safety briefing, because we need to get through to the controllers the fact that we're asking for a basic service to help them know where we are, not really because we want a service from them. Now, basic service is actually the lowest in a hierarchy of flight information services. Other services you could get in Class G airspace are traffic service, which requires radar and for you to have a transponder. You could also get a deconfliction service, which requires radar and a transponder and is only available if you're flying IFR. And there is such a thing as a procedural service, which I won't go into. If you need more information on any of this, see the course slides or CAP 1434, which covers flight information services outside controlled airspace. If you ask for a traffic service and you don't have a transponder, you'll almost certainly be given a basic service instead. And in general, the possibility that you'll get a different service to the one that you asked for means that the service type is a mandatory readback. If you ask for a basic service, even if the controller gives you a basic service, you then have to read back basic service. Let's talk briefly about MATSs. A MATS is a military ATZ. It's an area surrounding many military airfields. It is technically the same class as the surrounding airspace. So a MATS in Class G, the airspace inside the MATS is also Class G airspace. Civilian aircraft don't need to get permission to enter a MATS, but it is good airmanship to let them know before you're going in. And the terminology to use for this is request MATS penetration. The reply that should come back is MATS penetration approved. Now, this is not a clearance. It's not in the list of mandatory readback items in CAP 413. But examiners that we were working with last year nevertheless seem to expect it to be read back. So an exam tip is, if you're sitting the practical exam, read back MATS penetration approved if a MATS is involved. The MATS will, of course, contain an ATZ embedded within it, and you definitely do need specific entry clearance to go into the embedded ATZ. You should normally request basic service at the same time as you ask for your MATS penetration, and be ready, of course, to report your position if asked by the controller. And finally, always, always sign off with leaving the frequency or changing to. So let's imagine you're going into Lakenheath. First of all, you have to find out what channel to call on. You might find it on the frequency card in the top right of this slide. You might find it on the half-mil chart. You can see I've arrowed an excerpt from the chart there showing that the CMATS channel is 128.900. And you might even find it in the AIP, although that's something you consult before flight. Retune, listen, get the QNH from other traffic on the channel, and then request basic service and MATS penetration. And we're going to practice that this evening. Last item for this evening, and the second thing we're going to practice in the breakouts, is crossing Class D controlled airspace. Now, this comes in varying shapes and surrounds many regional airports and indeed now major airports like Heathrow, which have commercial air traffic. So Norwich, Doncaster, Aberdeen, for instance, all have a Class D area around them. And so does Brize Norton, unusually a military airfield with Class D. And it's Brize Norton we're going to be practicing on this evening. A clearance is required to enter that Class D zone. So to get that clearance, you would once again get the channel, and then about 10 minutes from the boundary, call them up on the channel you found on the frequency card and request zone penetration. You must give your flight rules at this point, either VFR or IFR. Normally, when you're talking to a controller, you're not required to give flight rules, but when you're requesting a clearance, you must give your flight rules. If you hear the word cleared from the controller, then you have a clearance to enter. If you don't hear the word cleared, then you do not, and you must not enter. If you hear the word cleared, then you must read back the clearance as heard in full. Power pilots, I guess, will write it down on their kneeboard. If we're in a glider, that might be a bit difficult. So do feel free to ask the controller to say again, if required, so that you can get the whole of the clearance and read it back word perfect. You can ask for an IFR, VFR, or a special VFR clearance, but you're only going to get an IFR clearance if you have a Mode S transponder, must specifically be Mode S. If you get a VFR clearance into Class D, then there are cloud separation requirements. If you're above 3,000 feet AMSL in Class D, then you must be more than 1,000 feet vertically and 1,500 meters horizontally from cloud. If you get a special VFR clearance, then you could simply be in sight of the surface and clear of cloud at any altitude. If you're transponding when you go into the zone, you will likely be put under radar control. And the controller will be able to guarantee, if you're IFR traffic, your separation from other IFR traffic or SVFR traffic. But he or she will not guarantee your separation if you're VFR. If you're cleared VFR into Class D airspace, separation from all other traffic is nevertheless your responsibility, although the controller will give you all the help that they can. Use the call sign glider. It comes with a special hidden guarantee. If you use the call sign glider, that automatically means that you may deviate by up to 2 nautical miles from track as you cross the Class D, and you may stop to thermal unless you've been specifically told otherwise. If you don't use the call sign glider, you don't get those guarantees. You may get an altitude or a route restriction. So for instance, your clearance may say at altitude 4,000 feet or below on QNH 1020. It may say something like remain east of the ATZ. When you get the clearance, if it comes with a route restriction, you must read back the route restriction. If you are unable to comply with the restriction, then you must tell the controller, and as soon as possible, and certainly before you actually have to break the restriction. So rattled through that very quickly, just about 25 minutes, but now's the moment. If you have any questions, please ask them to Chula. And I noticed there are a few in my channel as well, so Chula, I'll go after you.
Thanks, Henry. Right. Forgive me, I won't generally mention people's names just in the interest of speed. And in the interest of speed and maximizing practice time, I'm going to prioritize the questions which relate to radio technique as opposed to detail of the law. Right. When flying, say, Scottish, we announce our intention to cross an airway. We state VFR and Squawk 7000. Is this correct? Yes, as far as I know. If there is some special requirement, then I'm happy for Andrew or anyone who knows to say about that. Someone says, I'll be away in Austria for a week 6. Can I do it after? These are all recorded. I think Paul will send it to you. Is it legal to request special VFR clearance if you don't have a cloud rating? You need to have an instrument rating or an IRR, instrument rating restricted. So the cloud rating doesn't allow you to use an SVFR.
Can I come in there?
Yeah.
There's no. You can get special VFR. You don't need a cloud rating for special VFR. I think that's okay.
Oh, my mistake.
Yeah, because you might be merely close to cloud rather than in cloud.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks very much, Paul. I noticed the version of online slides are different from the presentation slides. So just to say that the main course slides that Paul and Andrew have created, that's one set of slides. The slides that Andrew has used, we're calling these the evening online slides, they will be on Paul's site. Should I put the transponder on to standby when changing codes? If you've got an old steam-driven transponder, then yes, so you don't accidentally squawk, for instance, an emergency code. On the new digital ones, you don't need to do that. How will a controller indicate that a limitation is no longer applicable? For instance, that an altitude limit is no longer applies to you. Cardiff once asked me to stay below a certain level on 1013. They just told me in plain English that the restriction, they said, thank you for your help, and I was free to maneuver as I wished. So it's a plain English answer. That's what I recalled. If landing out with a basic service, at what time should you leave the frequency? My answer to that is, of course, has to be aviate first. And then my next answer is leave before you're pressurized with the landing. If you do end up in the field without speaking to them, then ring them afterwards and tell them what's happened. I will cover landing in the field and who you might ring next week as well. On the basic, next one, on the basic service obligations, it states free to maneuver. Oh, I think we've just covered this. Oh, presumably you're free to maneuver as you wish. Presumably this means that you must still remain outside the ATZ. Yes. A couple of people have said that actually, this is interesting, that people are using in Scotland Scottish information, and I think a Sutton Bank colleague said that people are using it there. And somebody's made the point that if you're over inhospitable terrain, then it's a good idea to be using it. So someone might have an idea where you are if you come down in the mountains. Sounds like good airmanship to me. London information. I assume you need to report leaving the frequency. If so, when? Yes, you do need to, because you'll have a basic service, so that complies, apart from courtesy, that complies with what Andrew said. You can't be in a service and just disappear. So leave when you no longer wish to speak to them, and probably, certainly in the context of the exam, that means when you've got a new, more appropriate frequency to call. If you're passing a point on a course of north or south, and north or south of beam is a bit of a nonsense, surely it should be a cardinal point or a beam. I'm not sure I follow that, but here's the generalized advice. So long as you say exactly where you are in plain English so the controller knows where you are, that's all that's required. And certainly that's all that's required for the radio exam, being clear.
And Chula, on that, yes, under those circumstances, you'd report west to beam or east to beam.
Yeah, if that's what it meant, then yeah. If you intend to overfly in mats, is it worth calling them? Generalized answer has to be yes. They're going to have some stuff that might climb pretty quickly, and why wouldn't you? Sophie, one of our controllers, says, it's worth noting that on rare occasions, the services denied. You don't have to leave the frequency. You could maintain a listening watch for your own situational awareness. That's a very good point, and that's what many of us would do. So that is 99% of the time the right thing to do. If you're in the exam, then go on to another frequency. What if they refuse a MATS penetration? Well, as most of us know, MATS penetration can't be refused. It's really one of these theoretical what ifs. If, however, somebody does, then there's probably some extraordinarily good reason for it.
Maybe I can make a comment there, because I've had that on occasion. If you try to go through Marham's MATS, for example, they fly the new Lightning fighter out of Marham. So if you talk to the Marham controller and they're about to launch a four-ship, they might be a bit resistant to you ploughing through their MATS in the way of their four-ship. Generally, I take the view that I will cooperate as much as I can. So I don't insist on my right to get in their way.
Yes, thanks. Mike says, is it acceptable to say returning to gliding frequency? Frankly, that's what I do. So I say changing to national gliding frequency and read out the frequency. However, again, for the exam, I suggest you go to the next normal air service traffic unit. That would be the simple thing to do. But I accept the generality of that good advice. Do you need to include flight rules when requesting entrance to an ATZ? No, is the answer. Around Luton, there are lots of little pockets of Class D. If given a clearance to enter, what does that mean in context? Is there a clearance for a specific pocket or all of them? So if you're given a Class D clearance, it will tell you, excuse me, the controller will tell you the limits and extent of that clearance. So enter at Purton, cross the 26 threshold, exit somewhere else. So you will have no doubt what the extent of the clearance is. Chris, one of the coaches, says zone penetration or zone transit. Cat 413 seems to say zone transit. I don't know if this is right. What I say is if I'm going through and out the other side, I say transit. If I'm in power and landing within, then I suppose I might say penetration. I
think we had this one last year, didn't we? And I think if you read Cat 413, they tend to talk about MATS penetration and zone transit for some reason, but they mean pretty much the same thing.
Okay. Certainly not worth getting wrapped around the axle over. Why would you request a penetration at Bryce, CTR, and not a MATS? Can a penetration be requested for other Class Ds? Why would you request a penetration? Well, okay, I'm not sure I quite understand what your question is, Chris. I beg your pardon. But here's the thing. It's Class D. It's non-negotiable. You have to ask for a penetration, a zone transit. Unlike a MATS, which is theoretically optional, although not good RT practice. Chris, if I've missed the point and if you think it's relevant for people to know, then come in at the end. I thought IFR was a qualification. No, it's instrument flight rules. It's about the weather, not your qualifications. Is an ATC penetration a clearance or approval? Andrew, I'm going to leave that one for you at the end. You can come back on that. Can you clarify special VFR? No, I'm going to say read the slides with respect, because I'll just get into a tangle. And at the end of the day, this is a radio course. Would you ever request a MATS penetration crossing? Again, let's not worry about whether it's a crossing or penetration. If you can do the initial message as per the format and the full message as per the format, that's all we need to know. How would you actually say you can no longer fly with a clearance given some time ago? Okay, so the radio word to use here, the relevant language is unable, and preferably give a reason why you're unable. My experience is that London information is regularly NOTAM'd, unavailable over the last 2 years. Would you agree? Yes. Is there a reason you'd request an IFR clearance in a glider? I can't think of one, and if it is, it's 0.000 or something percent. Should you say 1 to 2 POB crossing? No, it's not in the standard format. So you don't say the POB unless somebody's asked you for it. POB means persons on board. Scottish Info is a radar service, unlike London. Okay, let me just, Rob. Thank you. We've had controllers say it is and it isn't. I think this is probably the most useful thing to say. If you call London information or Scottish information, you're getting a basic service, and you should assume that it's not radar. I think that's the practical thing to say there. Rob, thanks for that. Oh goodness!
You certainly can't rely on getting any traffic information.
No, exactly.
That's the important point.
Yeah. Do you ever fly flight plans when gliding? To all intents and purposes, no. Class D exemption says you can fly near cloud. Why might you need special VFR? Paul, come to that later, would you?
Yeah.
Or now, if you like.
Well, I can cover it as well. Below 3,000 feet, you can fly all the way up to the cloud. Above 3,000 feet, you need to obey those cloud clearances. Now, there is a set of slides I recorded a couple of years ago, which is essentially the bronze introduction to air law. They're linked from Paul's website. Do feel free to go and work your way through that. It should explain things like exactly what VFR and IFR are, what the cloud separation requirements are, and such like. Hopefully that'll answer those questions.
Yeah, so the thing you need to do is distinguish between VFR and IFR, which are the flight rules, and VMC and IMC, which is the weather. And remember the fact that you can be IMC and not in a cloud. So we often fly IMC, and actually we're flying IFR. But you've got to go read the slides to work that one out and think about it hard.
Yeah, thanks again, Paul. I may have misspoke earlier. Adam's got a good one here. On the time element of a position report. So, for example, if, and I think the notes say 47, that's 47 minutes past the hour. And the point that Adams raises is this, that the time relates to the time that you were at that position. So if you imagine an airliner, this is the best way to teach this point, crossing a mandatory position report, and the frequency now, and I have it as minute 07, if the frequency is busy, and the pilot doesn't get in for the next 2 minutes, the position report is still 07. Does the 2 nautical mile deviation allowance apply to a restriction given by ATC? Yes.
No.
Well, hang on. If they say don't fly closer than, then you'd better not fly closer than.
So I did the negotiation with the CAA on this one.
Okay.
So let me try and address it. Basically, what we're saying is, if we say we're heading west, we don't have to. The understanding is that gliders won't go in exactly the same direction, and they might stop and circle and thermal. So we've got a bit of latitude, basically. The latitude is, we might be 30 degrees off track for a while. We might be up to a couple of miles. But if you're given a restriction on a clearance, that's a solid thing.
Yeah.
If it's no, you mustn't go beyond this line, then it's don't go beyond this line.
That trumps everything.
That trumps everything.
Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
that's what I was trying to convey.
You do what you've agreed.
Yeah. So Jack Deese says, Scottish Information were giving traffic information today for what it's worth, working quite hard to deliver it. Okay, well, fine, but it doesn't. Okay, but you can't, if you're in receipt of a basic service, which is, I presume, what they were offering, then you cannot rely that will always be happening. Scottish have an ATM, so can see transponder aircraft, but can only provide a basic. Chris Fox, thank you. That's
yeah, so do London, but the point is you don't get
you're
not going to get traffic automatically. It's not part of the contract.
Yeah. Dorian, if given a VFR clearance rather than a special VFR and the clouds are close to you, what's the procedure? Again, I will let somebody else take that. Paul, do you want to take that?
Yeah, if you have agreed to stay VFR in Class D, and we're talking Class D, not Class G here, in Class D, then you're meant to stay that far from the clouds. If you can't do that, it might be worth telling the controller that you can't remain VFR.
I mean,
Right.
the VFR is part of your clearance, right? You know,
The VFR is part of your
if you're
clearance,
going to
yeah.
break the terms, you have to tell them.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for all the questions, Andrew, Paul. That's it.
Gosh, Shula, I'm glad you had to do all of those. Only two or three made their way to me, which I'll do my best with. I think we've already covered this one. Can we state IFR when asking for clearance without having the appropriate ratings? Well, as we've already covered, if you're close to cloud, you can be legal to fly there as a glider pilot with your gliding certificate, and yet still be flying in IMC or IFR. So, David, I think we've covered that question.
If you're going to start thinking about flying IFR in controlled airspace, you really need to know what you're doing.
Indeed.
Wouldn't advise.
Yep. Somebody asks, Transponder, can you use a listening squawk without talking to ATC? Well, we haven't covered listening squawks, but the answer is yes. The whole point of the listening squawk is you dial up the listening squawk on your transponder. Sorry, that is actually an exception, I now realized, to what I said in the beginning of my slides. You would dial up the listening squawk on your transponder and listen on the appropriate channel. That's why it's called a listening squawk. That way the controller knows if they see that squawk on a track on their radar, they can call you up and know that you'll be listening. But we don't cover listening squawks in this course per se. There is a question about where the call sign goes in your calls. I'm not going to answer it directly, other than to say, just to reiterate once again, the general pattern is in your initial call, you start with who you're calling, who you are, and what service you want. So Lake and Heath approach, Glider Golf Charlie Hotel Sierra Kilo, request basic service and MATS penetration. Then in your main call, you start with who you are. Once Lake and Heath approach has come back to me, you'll see all this in the examples we're doing today. Once Lake and Heath has come back to me, I would put my call sign on the beginning of my full call. And after that, whilst I have the service, anytime I'm initiating the conversation with them, I would put my call sign on the beginning. So if I make a position report, a procedural position report, my call sign goes on the beginning. Otherwise, they don't know who's talking to them. On the other hand, if I'm responding to something they asked me to do, I put my call sign on the end, just to confirm this really was me replying to the call and not some other aircraft that got confused and thought that the controller was trying to talk to them. Hopefully it'll become clear when we work through the examples in a moment or two.
Andrew, Andrew, can I just, sorry, I'll just
Sure.
jump in and quickly say, while you read the next one. Keith Coach says, candidates need to know that listening squawks don't apply within controlled airspace. Thanks,
Yes.
Keith. So if you're in controlled airspace, you must be talking to the air traffic service unit, not using a listening squawk.
Yeah, and I don't, I'd be interested to know if any examiners have a different view, but I didn't hear of any examiners asking candidates to use listening squawks on the exams last year. Be interested to hear if that's not.
No, they're very useful actually. Flying around.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay,
I think that's
let's
it.
move on. I've set up the breakout groups.
Okay, hold on 1 second before we go to breakouts.
Yeah.
Just a couple of quick briefings on them, Paul.
Yeah.
So this is
Excellent.
just so that you know what you're about to do. The first exercise will be you're following the pink track on this map, this chart segment. You're flying basically over Cambridge, past Newmarket, headed for Bury St Edmunds, and then back, headed west. You will ask, probably somewhere around Newmarket, but it's up to you, you will ask Lake and Heath approach for a basic service and MATS penetration. You will probably report when you are turning Bury St Edmunds, and then after you have left the MATS, you will, of course, call to say leaving the channel, leaving the frequency rather, or changing to some other service, such as London Information. So that's the first breakout you're going to do this evening. The second one is Bryce Zone. You're going to cross the Bryce Class D airspace. You're coming down via Enstone, where we were last week. You're going to track pretty much due south between Witney and Aynsham, or you're going to hope to Wantage, and then turn back off to the northeast. So somewhere a little bit south of Enstone, you're going to call Bryce Zone and ask for a basic service and Class D crossing, or words to that effect. So we're going to do the wrap up now so that when you finish the breakouts, you can just leave the call straight away. We don't have to gather afterwards. So for next time, please review the Part 4 course materials, which is for the TMG flight. Things like ATZ entry and landing will be covered then. If you have any further questions, then please send email. And for those of you who haven't discovered it yet, there is a handy application called Script Rehearser, which you can load onto your phone. And we have Script Rehearser scripts for the 2 exercises we're doing this week, and also the week 2 exercises around Enstone, where you can practice, if not talking to a real human being, at least talking to a disembodied voice coming out of Script Rehearser to practice your responses, make sure, give you a chance to do some practice if you haven't got a real person to practice with. Okay, that's it from me. So if nobody's got anything else, Paul, I think we're pretty much ready to go to breakouts.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to breakouts then. Andrew's described 2 tasks for you to do, but you don't have to come back up for the breakout. Once you're complete, you can quit. You don't need to come back to us. Please make a note of which room you get sent to, because if you drop out for some reason, I will then be able to send you back to that room. So unless there's anything else, I'm going to open all the rooms.